Hello and welcome to the Defining Test Strategy webinar with software testing statesman Paul Gerard, and I'll be your host, Simon Knight. During the webinar, Paul's going to answer the question, what is test strategy, by sharing some insights from his lengthy career in the software testing space. After that, he's going to have some tips on how you can go about creating a good one, test strategy that is. At which point I'll probably chip in with some pointers on how TestRail can help you achieve some of the things that Paul is talking about. After all of that, as usual, we're hoping to have some time for questions and answers, and that'll be your opportunity to address any challenges that you're having with your own software testing strategies or your own anything testing strategies. Before we do that, we've got the usual housekeeping announcements. So we'll be keeping everybody on mute throughout the entire webinar. If you've got any questions or comments, please do feel free to share them in the chat room, and we will try to pick them up during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If we don't get around to answering your question, don't panic. We'll try and follow up with some answers in a blog post afterwards, in which we will also share a link to the webinar video, since we will be recording it, and we'll share it with you as soon as that video has been processed and is ready to share. We're aiming to keep the webinar to around an hour. Hopefully we won't go over that. So I'm Simon Knight. I'm the TestRail product manager. If you've got any questions, issues, suggestions, etc. about how you can improve your TestRail experience, you can reach out to me. And you can do that via the socials, or get in contact with our team via the contact@gurok.com email address. On the webinar with us today, we have Paul Gerard. Woohoo! If you get around the testing circuit at all, I'm sure you will recognize Paul. You'll likely have heard Paul speak, keynote, train, or chair at some of those testing conferences. He's also been organizing and hosting the regular test management forum, which is now called the Assurance Leadership Forum. I've been along to the last couple of those, and I can certainly say that they're well worth attending. So if you need someone to speak, train, or write about testing, Paul's your man, and you can find him via the links provided. Paul, there's no mention of how long you've actually been working in testing. It's been a goodish while though, right?
I'm afraid it has. I probably got started in testing specifically in 1992. So what's that? 26 years.
I was thinking more sort of punch card era. I was a little bit out.
but I actually started testing. Well, I could tell a story.
Oh, Paul, we have lost you. Okay, it seems like we've got a slight technical problem. Please bear with us if you're on the webinar. I think we've lost Paul mid-flow. Hopefully he'll be back soon. Hello, Paul, you're back.
I'm here. I don't know what happened then. I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Please continue.
Okay, so am I in charge now?
Not yet, no. I think you were mid-flow. You were going to share a story, or
not? No.
Okay.
It might come up. It might come up at the end.
All right. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have some time for that. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Gerard. Links on the page. I'm going to hand over to you now, Paul, for the body of the webinar. Let me just do that. There we go. So you should be presenting now, Paul.
So I am. Great stuff. Thanks, Simon. I mean, the story I was just going to say was, when I asked people when did they start testing, what I argue is actually you start testing when you're a few months old, because when you watch a young baby, the first thing they can do when they can hold something in their hand is what? They put whatever it is in their mouth, whether it's a piece of food or a little biscuit or a worm or a piece of Lego, whatever the hell it is, it always goes in the mouth. So you taste it, you test it, and that's when we start testing. And there's an argument to be had that our education systems systematically crush, in some ways, our curiosity and innate desire to survive through feeding ourselves. So I think testing starts at a very, very early age. At any rate, what I want to talk about for the next, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes or so is test strategy, which is everyone knows what test strategy is, don't they? And yet I do feel when I meet people, you know, in projects, with clients, in conferences, that actually you scratch the surface of what people talk about when they discuss strategy, and they're just talking about something very straightforward. It's just the way they do things. And it seems to me that not enough people apply the thought required to derive a test strategy from their situation. So I want to explore what a test strategy is, first of all, and then, as Simon said in the intro, I want to walk through some concepts, if you like, of test strategy. I call them, they're derived from something I call axioms, but I'll explore some of those. It's not a completely comprehensive study of test strategy. I think that's more than could be related in a webinar, but I want to give you a flavor of the thought processes that you have to go through, the questions you need to ask to understand what you need to do in test strategy. Now, in many ways, what test strategy does is it describes how you're going to approach the testing in your project, whether that project is a 1,000-man-year waterfall structured project over 3 years, or it's how you're operating inside an agile team that has a very dynamic kind of behavior, where stories are coming in every week and you're delivering almost on a weekly basis. But I also want to suggest that if you're moving into the world of continuous delivery and DevOps and a very different approach to software delivery than certainly waterfall, and I think agile too, I think the thought processes are the same. The questions you ask when you come up with a test, when you need to derive a test strategy, are the same. But what happens is the answers vary. So let me just sort of make a start and talk about process briefly. Now, to many people, the test strategy is a definition of the process you will follow, which is like how things get done, how you will progress testing in your project. But process, in many people's eyes, has a kind of tarnished reputation. And when you talk about process, the process gurus almost take you to a place that is documentation heavy, highly ceremonial and formal, and rather bureaucratic. This all came about in the 80s, I think, where industry took over process and structured methods as they were then and over-engineered them. The original advocates of structured methods, you know, advocated diagramming on A4 sheets of paper, hand-drawn diagrams, for example, and what they tried to suggest was an approach to defining processes on paper in a very informal way, what you might do on a whiteboard now, got overtaken by industry who wanted to deliver case tools and technologies to support hyper sophisticated process. So in some ways, industry over-engineered process. It took them to be universal, took process to be universal, and kind of failed. And the whole agile movement from the turn of the millennium, when that came along, that was a reaction against process that was too heavy, too cumbersome to use. The little diagram is only a little illustration of when I talk about test strategy. I'm not looking at processes as complex and as convoluted as the little picture you've got there, the procrastination flowchart. So let me step back and say, well, okay, what is the challenge of test strategy? You know, what is the problem, you know, we're trying to solve? What I'm trying to suggest is that regardless of your process, whether it's waterfall or you're agile or continuous delivery and kind of a DevOps approach, which I think is a third way, not an extension to agile, almost every organization is using some form of hybrid. So in a highly structured, waterfall-oriented project, there are pockets of agility. Within agile projects, agile teams rather, agile teams often have to hand over their software deliveries to business people who are working in a highly structured, waterfall-oriented environment, slow-moving, hierarchical kind of environment. What I'm trying to suggest is that every organization has to compromise in various places to get things done in their own way. So I don't think, beyond the extremes of 100% waterfall and 100% agility, let's say, everyone's somewhere on that spectrum where there are pockets of agility, pockets of waterfall, and maybe if you're into continuous delivery in that respect, pockets of that too. So if everyone is on that spectrum, everyone's process is different. And if everyone's process is different, everyone's test strategy is probably affected and different in that pattern. So we have a bit of a challenge in that you can't pick a test strategy off the shelf and say, this is the way we're going to do things around here. So you have to almost evolve a strategy that works for you. And what I want to do is to try and get you thinking of how you structure your questions, structure your, if you like, gaps of knowledge that you have to address, structure the decision-making you have to make into a method, if you like. And what I want to suggest is there's not a real method, but there's a pattern of questioning. And so what I want to do is introduce you to this pattern of questioning, and I'll call that a test strategy framework. Now, in order to do this, what tends to happen is people get bogged down in the technicalities. So as soon as you start thinking about test strategy, someone might say, well, okay, what tools are you going to use and when? Well, hold on. Before you jump into the technology of the tools you're going to use for test automation, you have to step back and say, well, hold on, what are we trying to achieve here? And how are we going to arrive at our destination in a systematic way with technology, perhaps? What I'm trying to suggest is that you need to separate the thinking that you need to do to derive a strategy that is meaningful. You need to separate that thinking from the end product, what I will call logistics. Logistics are kind of how you will do things, how you will document, how you will prioritize, how you will maybe use tools to implement an automated approach, and so on. So what happens when you talk about strategy and you kind of get to the nub of the matter, the questions that arise are always the same. But what you find in every project you come to, the answers are what vary. So I want to use this notion of what I'll call test axioms. These are kind of principles, that I hold to be true. And I hope in your projects you would hold them to be true too. And I don't want to get into the debate about, well, are there universal principles in testing, yes or no? I think there are, and I'll call them axioms because some things are axiomatic. I hope that will come out in the conversation that we'll come to in a few minutes. But each axiom, what these things are these principles, if you like. They were basically documented in a little pocketbook because a few years ago, I think 8 or 9 years ago now, and it was I was kind of frustrated that I kept on asking the same questions again and again and again of projects, and I thought surely there's a pattern here. And what I did was in a little pocketbook is I tried to come up with these patterns of questioning and derive some principles that underpin them. You can see the detail of what these axioms look like in the website testaxioms.com. Do take a look. 50% of the pocketbook is actually on the website. I give away the pocketbooks when I meet people. You can buy them, but I don't sell too many because mostly I give them away. There's also a lean pub version. So, but the idea I'm trying to put to you is that you need to concentrate on the thought processes to answer the questions and make decisions on your strategy, and not get bogged down in what I will call logistics. Okay. Now, the next thing to say is it could be that if you're working in a bank or a high integrity project, where this, the software is safety critical and could kill people potentially, you may have to document every little detail of your strategy and almost every aspect of your projects and software right throughout. So potentially a test strategy could be 100 or 1,000 page document, who knows? But that's not the point. in your agile team, it could be that your test strategy is actually a single sheet of paper, or it's just a few bullet points that you stick on a whiteboard to remind people of how you tackle certain issues with respect to testing. So I'm not interested in the scale of documentation or the format of the documentation to capture the knowledge and the decisions made in your strategy. I'm much more interested in the activity of creating the strategy itself. So this is asking questions, getting answers where you can, and then picking up from that how you're going to formulate your approach. So Eisenhower famously said, you know, of the D-Day plan, planning is everything, the plan is nothing. I mean, the point about this is it's the activity of asking the questions and having those negotiations in some respects that matters. The outcome is important, but that's not really where the value is. The value is in the conversations almost. So strategy answers questions and makes decisions. Now, the challenge we have with most software projects is we can answer some questions and make some decisions now, but potentially other questions have to wait. We can't answer every question at the start of the project. So in this respect, the way I think about the certainty of the answers of the questions and the decisions you make, I think there's kind of three levels. So there's kind of some choices and decisions you can make now, today. Then there are some choices and decisions that you can't make today, but the the strategy can define how those decisions will be made based on the data that will be available through the project. So an example would be your incident management process, for example, an obvious one. Thirdly, there are some things that you can't plan for, just unplanned events, acts of God almost. There might be some principles that you set out and say, well, we'll adopt a risk-based approach to prioritizing if we're put under time pressure and have to squeeze the testing. That kind of thing. So where you can't make that decision not now and the data isn't available now, it could be that you can set out some principles which will help you arrive at a decision. So the idea is to raise questions early to get people thinking, and also to raise awareness of what testing is going to do for people, but also to start negotiating what testing will deliver. Certainly, a lot of the questions you ask are going to cause some consternation because people will not have thought about these things in much detail. So the framework is basically a list of areas, and I've kind of categorized them into three what I've called components. The stakeholder questions relate to who are our customers for testing? Who is going to use the information that we produce, our test outcomes? Who's going to use that information to make decisions? Then we have well, okay, I understand what the goal of testing is, but how are we going to select or define or design the test to achieve the mission? That's the design area. And then delivery is how are we going to actually deliver the results, the outcomes to our stakeholders for them to take on the decision making. So in the test axioms, the little book, pocket book, I identify 16 kind of principles. I've got about 8 or 10, I think, coming up that I've kind of merged 2 or 3 just to make it a bit more palatable. Simon will, I hope, chip in every now and then to suggest where TestRail can support your decision making in the strategy, certainly when it comes to capturing information and supporting reporting and decision making with stakeholders.
So I certainly will.
So without further ado, I'll just crack on and just dive straight into it and talk about stakeholders. So in your project, when the conversation turns to stakeholders, you would normally consider these to be people or organizations or classes of people, if you like, who have a stake in the outcome of your project. And we normally think about, customers and suppliers and partners and maybe government and so on and so forth. I'm not talking about stakeholders in the round for the whole project or program or sprint, if you like, almost. What I'm talking about is who is the customer for the information you're going to produce as a tester. Who are these people? So typically they are end users who might be your subject matter experts. The developers certainly are one of your customers because you're going to be giving them feedback on the quality of the software and obviously bug reports and that kind of thing. Your product owner, product manager, and so on. you need to understand what they're trying to achieve through testing. So if they have to make decisions and the testing is going to provide the data for them to make that decision, we need to have that conversation about, well, what is the decision? What information do you need? When do you need it? What regularity? What format? Blah, 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 blah. So the whole notion of understanding your stakeholders is like understanding your customers and what they want and how you're going to deliver it.
This is that just going back to that one, Paul. That's always a bit of a funny one for me, because I'm like an ex-tester who now wears a product manager hat. So I find myself wanting information from testing.
Yep.
And typically the kind of information I'm wanting from that testing is, you know, what have we tested? Is it done yet? Can we ship it?
Yeah.
But when I wear my testing hat, I'm like right down in the weeds of, you know, what that testing actually looks like at a much more granular level. And
Yeah.
you know, it's important to realize that your stakeholders don't necessarily want that level of detail, right? And tailoring what it is that you're giving to them accordingly.
Exactly. So if you're a tester and you find an anomaly in the software and it fails in some way, you're going to hand over a lot of detail, maybe, you know, your whole environment as a virtual machine, to a developer who's going to take that and use that to diagnose the problem and maybe learn how to fix it and so on and so forth. Yeah. Whereas if you're sat at the board level with a mountain of paperwork, which is the outcome from all the tests throughout the program from perhaps tens or hundreds of people, they're not going to want to see all that detail. You have to summarize in a way that makes sense to them. So the first thing is to understand you've got multiple stakeholders. It's not just this kind of fictitious user or fictitious customer that you've just got to deliver to. It varies. They want different things typically because they have different decisions to make, to commit a piece of code to the library, to transition between integration and system testing, to deploy into production, to withdraw a production deliverable for some reason. These are all different decisions. And certainly the business people want things that are much less technical and much more connected to their business and to their understanding of their business. So the challenge, what I find when I talk to testers too often is I say, well, who's your stakeholder? And they just go blank. They don't know. They don't actually know who is going to, they don't think about who is going to see the information they produce. They just think, well, I'm just going to create some scripts, I'm going to run some tests, I'm going to log some bugs, and then I'm going home. And then the day after, I might be doing some retesting, and I might be doing some regression testing, but they don't think about the deliverable from testing other than as a set of activities. So the deliverable from testing is information for other people to make decisions. That's kind of, you know, I mean, if you're interviewing a tester, ask them who their stakeholder is, or you know how they find out their stakeholders, or how they interact with stakeholders. It's a critical aspect of it. So, with regards to the confidence stakeholders have, I've used this, you know, stakeholder confidence kind of label for this aspect. But you think, well, what's the value of testing to a stakeholder? Well, the value of testing is, does it give them confidence in their decision making? What evidence do they need to see which will allow them to make a go live decision, or a let's wait, develop and test for another 6 weeks and then delay delivery, whatever? What information do they need to make these calls? And the confidence they make in those decisions is based on the quality of the testing outcomes. So I think you want to say something, Simon?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd just chip in and say that the benefit of using a test management system, TestRail in this case, is it gives you a kind of single source of truth for all of the artifacts, all of the information that's generated during the kind of testing activities. So in the screenshot there, you can see in the top left that there's testing activity taking place and what that activity is, and then, you know, going around to some of the other screenshots, you can see that things are passing, failing, what's been tested, what's not been tested, how that testing relates to your other points of reference. So those things might be Jira tickets, or, you know, you may be using some other systems like Axosoft or
Yep.
So the Microsoft stack, Team Foundation server, all of those kind of things. And the point is that your test management system, TestRail, provides you with a mechanism for storing all of that information and exposing it to your stakeholders so that they can have confidence in the testing that's being carried out and see what that testing actually looks like.
Yep. Okay, I'll move on. So again, from the perspective of strategy, rather than the practicalities that Simon's talking about, and I should have made that distinction. I'm still, if you like, head in the clouds trying to do the strategic view. A critical thing to the test manager, the team, the individual tester is to understand scope. And scope is basically a nebulous thing until you pin it down. So if you like, if you ask a tester, well, what tests could you run on this system? The tester will probably say, well, there's an infinite number of things I can do. You have to give me some parameters to scope down to the things that are really critical to you as the stakeholder and to the to measure, if you like, achievement and the quality of the product. So how will scope be defined? It might simply be a statement that's made as it's going to be, the scope is limited to module ABC 1, 2, 3, and there's an end to it. Or it might be that we're going to scope this part of a project or this whole program according to a business process that may be defined, that you can say, well, we're only going to test the software with respect to the ability to collect money from our suppliers, I beg your pardon, our customers. So scope is the scope is not answered in the strategy. What the strategy says, or the question in the strategy, is how are we going to define scope? And then when it comes to planning the testing, or just planning the testing in a sprint or a huge program, how are we going to arrive at this definition of scope? That's the point. When things change and scope changes, either because of failures in the delivered product or just the business context changes, how are we going to manage the impact of changes to that scope? So this is what the strategy is looking at.
And again, I guess looking at this from a kind of practical level, quite often the way that I will see scope being defined, particularly in a more agile sort of Scrum-based context, is in the form of stories, epics, tickets, basically moving through a system like Jira, and that could be on a Kanban board, or depending on how you're managing your project. A ticket could relate to a specific requirement instead of a story. And again, from a very practical sort of TestRail perspective, one of the ways that we would recommend managing the scope of your testing is by associating your tests via references with those specific tickets, whether it's in Jira or some other system.
Yep, exactly. I'll move on. So the next thing is, if you are the tester on the ground, let's say, it's easy to think in those terms for a moment, is when you are asked to test this component, this feature against this story or this subsystem or this interface or whatever it is, the tester, the first questions they start to ask is, well, hold on. Firstly, what is it that I'm testing? What is the boundaries of this object? Where are my sources of knowledge to tell me what the feature, the system, the interface should do? How am I going to derive tests, but also outcomes from those sources of knowledge? So I need an oracle for expected behavior. Now, what usually happens is people believe that all the requirements are defined in the requirements document, and yet we know that requirements documents are never tell you everything you need to know, no matter what level of detail they're written in. They're never going to give you everything you need. So our sources of knowledge tend to be a documentary, a piece of evidence, a story maybe, but it also is like, well, hold on, well, the person you need to consult in this area is this subject matter expert, or this product owner, or these developers who are building this interface, who have the technical detail you need to derive tests and to understand how you make progress. So our sources of knowledge, that is, our sources of knowledge that we trust, perhaps to put it more explicitly, the strategy should be identifying these sources. So these sources aren't just typically just a document. That's rather overambitious for almost every project in the universe. We always have to use other sources of information. And one of the key ones for a tester on the ground is their own experience and intuition. They are going to draw on this experience to help them make choices in their testing, but also when they witness a test and make a judgment on whether it's a pass or fail, it's a failure, or it's just an anomaly or something else fishy going on. Yep. By the way, humans also have biases and prejudices and so on and so forth, and we'll come to that in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, I love this point. So in the screenshot, I mean, it kind of shows you again a reference to a ticket, probably within Jira or something like that, which is, you know, the requirement or the story that is related to the thing that's being tested. But I love the sort of context-driven perspective on this, and the notion of oracles. So I mean, you talked a little bit about intuition and experience, Paul, but if you sort of drill down into those things a little bit more, where does that intuition and experience come from? It comes from oracles. It comes from other systems, other applications that you've used that have similar properties, similar behaviors to the thing that you're testing at a given point in time. It comes from your understanding, your worldview, your observations of how things work in the world around you, and you're using those things as a point of reference, a comparison for the software or whatever it is you're testing, and as a kind of heuristic or rule of thumb to guide you towards a judgment that says, is this thing working correctly or not? Yep. And quite often, a thing that I will do, and a thing that I like to see in, you know, bug reports and stuff like that, is those references being cited. And it might be a pointer to a story, as in the screenshot, or it could be a pointer to some other oracle, some other reference point that says, well, you know, based on this feature, or, you know, whatever it is, isn't working as I would expect it to.
Exactly. Yeah. And ultimately, you might have several sources of information that will give you conflicting information. I mean, I have to say, it's very common for users to argue amongst themselves when you ask them what the requirement should really be, because they have different, you know, like the sales guy might want X, and then the marketeer might want Y, and the ops guy says, well, hold on, you can't have either of those until I get Z. And that negotiation can sometimes be triggered by the tester asking one of these awkward questions, like, what exactly should this feature do? You know, and so we have to understand, well, you know, should we be listening to ops people, or should we be listening to sales and marketing, or whoever these sources are, or should we stick to the specification? I hesitate to say that's a good option, I have to say, but it's a complex problem to understand where you get your information from in order to implement a test of almost any level of you know, at any level, whether it's a developer looking at a line of code to do something, or it's an interaction between our system and our bank. You know, it's at every level we have the same problem of saying, well, where do I get my knowledge from?
Speaking as a product manager stroke owner, I am fully aware that my requirements documents have glaring holes in them. So yeah, I definitely want to see my testers, you know, applying their skills in that area to figure out what other sources of knowledge they should be looking at as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll move on. So that obviously brings us to this notion of fallibility of our sources. So certainly people are fallible, documents are fallible. The existing system that we're trying to replace may be fallible too, maybe replacing it because it's fallible. The thing is, the sources of fallibility, the sources of uncertainty are almost everywhere. And so I think the strategy can't really give you an answer to how you resolve this, except to identify risky areas. Maybe there are certain features of the system that are inherently complex and therefore going to be difficult to specify, difficult to understand, difficult to write code for, and difficult to test. But identifying that as a special area, you might say, well, hold on, we're going to have a little huddle, a team, if you like, to focus on some aspect of complexity. Or there might be uncertainty over our business partner who have to specify an interface to us. And we have to keep pressure on them to give us a specification for the interface in order to get it early enough, to maybe prototype it, to build it, to test it, and then to evaluate it with our partners, in conjunction with our partners. So we have many sources of fallibility and uncertainty. What the strategy view would be is, how are we going to deal with, can we identify where these areas of uncertainty are? That would be really helpful. But also, how do we deal with this? Do we do reviews? Do we do prototyping? Do we have daily stand-ups to understand certain problems, or whatever? Okay, so our strategy is looking at how we deal with these known sources of uncertainty.
I'm just going to jump in quickly, Paul. So I think a lot of those bullets on that slide could fit under the umbrella of communication, and I think it's a key challenge. Working in the way that we do today, with teams in lots of different time zones, remote, lots of people remote working, and from an agile perspective, there's this sort of principle that everybody should be co-located and in one office, but we know that that's not the reality. And even if you are co-located, there's still lots of room for communication problems, right? And you mentioned a quote earlier. The plan is nothing, planning is everything. The quote that I like in terms of strategy is the Mike Tyson one. Everybody thinks they've got a plan up until the point where they get punched in the face. And so often in testing projects, I think the reason you get punched in the face is because of the things that you've outlined here, and because of basic failure in communication.
I'm sure most of the people on the webinar will have worked at some point in their careers on what you'd understand as a waterfall or a structured project of some scale. And it's almost inevitable that when you work on projects like this, that the promise of the quality or the delivery is always so much higher than when it actually hits the test team, who suddenly discover, these interfaces, these features don't exist, and they should have done. These interfaces exist but don't work. There's been some huge misunderstandings in the requirements versus the implementation, and so on and so forth. So if it hits the fan, as you well know, and that's the kind of the Tyson quote. It's like, it's only when someone comes along that actually tries to use the product in anger that you discover many of the flaws. Now the opportunity for testing is to say, well, hold on. With the mentality of the tester, you can go back to the requirement and say, well, look, suppose I run some scenarios over these requirements. And this is exactly what we do with stories and the whole BDD and the Cucumber. If you're into that kind of technology, as soon as you create a story, you create some scenarios to, if you like, to illustrate how that feature would be used. And that's the opportunity for testers to say, we haven't written a line of code yet, we don't understand the requirement yet, but I can run some suggest some scenarios which the users can say, aha, yeah, that makes sense, but hold on, it's more complicated than I thought. You've just triggered that thought in my head. And it's the tester's mentality that gives you that feedback, that allows the users to perhaps visualize what their product, what the final product will look like before the products exist. And the whole value of prototyping is exactly to do that, to to create a prototype which provides some limited functionality, to experiment and try out scenarios and get users to recognize their requirements are not good enough, or they're conflicting, or there are gaps, or ambiguous, or whatever. So the whole notion of feedback is built into Agile, less so in waterfall, and in continuous delivery it's perpetual feedback. The whole notion of continuous delivery is all about feedback. So source of uncertainty, feedback is the one big thing. Communication, absolutely fundamental to all this. Are we done with that one? I think I'll move on.
I think so.
Okay, so if you step back and say, well, what is testing? In the broadest sense, from the perspective of a tester, is a tester gathers information, builds mental models or documents models, on paper or on a whiteboard or in a formal way, in some way, and then those models are then used to reflect their understanding of the behavior of a system. Those models are then used to trace paths or to identify things to cover, and so on. So testing is always model-based. It might not require documentations of these models. They might be just mental models held temporarily in the mind of the tester, but all testing is model-based. Now, the models that can be used by testers might be handed down as part of the requirements. So a use case, for example, is a model of the behavior of a particular feature or a collection of features, depending on the level of its level. A flow chart representing the business process is a model. So testers can use that to trace paths through the business process and derive scenarios to use the system. A story, a business story in the Gherkin format. There's an example on the screen where we identify a feature and then we have a scenario given when then, that kind of construct, that triplet, if you like. Stories are models of a requirement. And the conversation I had with you a couple of days ago, Simon, about test cases, they are a model in their own respect as well, because they're a model of a presumed behavior of the system under test. So modeling is central to all testing. Graphical models are much more digestible to stakeholders if they're in the business or they're a developer. People like graphical models. Graphical models can be used to trace paths, to identify items to cover, and to derive tests from in a very simple way. And most of the test design techniques, if you're into the equivalence partitioning and boundary values, whatever, these are all based on different models. State models, decision tables, a risk register is a model of the modes of failure of a system that you project. So all these things are models. So the strategy is encouraging people to think in terms of models. The strategy might identify the specific models to be used. Thou shalt use a state model to describe the behavior and the testing of this telecom switch, for example. So models are central. A question I always ask testers when I meet them and saying, if I'm looking at what they're doing, I say, well, what model are you using to test? Most testers don't know how to answer that because they don't realize that testing is model-based. Once you explain what a model is, then they might say, oh, actually, what I've got in mind is this doodle I've got on a piece of paper here. Oh, that's a model. Okay, fantastic. But challenging testers on the modeling they're doing is a great way to understand how deep is their insight as to what the system should do, but also how sophisticated the testing they're doing is. I've probably overdone that one on models, but I'm a big advocate of thinking in terms of models.
Yep, you've said it all, Paul. I've got nothing to add.
Thank you, sir. Great stuff. Move on. So prioritization. So if you step back and think about any project you've ever worked on, when it comes down to testing, I don't think I've ever met a tester who didn't at some point have to say, I need more time to do what I need to do. And that time is not available. Now, whether the time is not available simply because the budget for testing is set too low, or the tester is thinking of too many wild and woolly things that they might want to test, at some point you've got to select what is in scope for testing in terms of the test cases and the tests, and what is not in scope. And the mechanism you use to prioritize some things into scope and some things out of scope, that needs to be understood at a strategic level, because you're making choices about what information you're going to give to stakeholders. If I don't test this feature and a stakeholder expects me to have done that, I'm going to get into great trouble when the stakeholder comes to make a decision about accepting that feature. Oh, I didn't realize that was in scope. Oh, how did that happen? Well, I didn't think it was a high enough. Well, hold on, how did you come to that conclusion? The strategy should identify a mechanism for prioritizing. It might simply say, Joe Bloggs is the guy that you go to, and he will decide, or she will decide, what's in scope and what's out of scope from the perspective of running tests, creating tests, running tests. So how you define a priority, how you assign priority are strategic questions. Over to you, Simon. I think you'll talk about that a little bit more.
Well, not really. I think the screenshot's fairly clear. I mean, obviously in TestRail, you can prioritize your test cases. I mean, the point is actually thinking through, the point that you're trying to make, I think, Paul, is that you need to have thought through how you're actually going to go about prioritizing those things in the first place. Once you've actually done the hard thinking and come up with a model for prioritization, actually implementing it should be fairly trivial.
I think so too. Yeah, exactly. Okay, moving on. Next one. For when it comes to running your tests, it could be that you're an individual tester, an agile team, and you've got a choice of, shall I run test A or test B right now? Well, somehow you're going to have to make a choice, aren't you? You're not going to be running them in parallel necessarily if you're doing a manual test. So whatever thought process you require to run this test before that one, or that one before this one, that should be something you should understand before you embark on it. Otherwise, if you don't have that knowledge, you're going to be testing in a kind of a random sequence, which might not necessarily be very helpful or as helpful to your stakeholders or to yourself in trying to understand how the system works. At a macro level, at a larger project scale level, there are definite sequences of suites of tests, whole test plans that have to be run in order because, for example, early tests might capture master data to check all the master data update screens before you embark on transactional testing. It's better to be confident that the data in the system is accurate before you start using it in test transactions that use that data, and so on. So if there are criteria available to guide how you sequence your testing, you should identify them at a strategic level, okay? And at least advise testers that, well, okay, we don't have any reason to run this test before that one. Maybe just run them alphabetically or something like that. It makes no odds. The challenge for the strategy is to set down a mechanism for sequencing tests if sequencing tests is an important thing.
Yeah, I think the areas where I tend to see this being kind of critically important are in sort of non-functional testing, where the engineering overhead tends to be quite high in terms of, you know, staging performance tests or, you know, things like that, where there's a lot of effort involved in getting the environment into the right state to then be able to carry out potentially a sequence of performance tests against it. I think from a sort of functional kind of testing perspective, the notion of using test steps as highlighted in the screenshot is fairly well understood, and a good way of sequencing your testing should you need to.
Yeah, I mean, if you have to sequence tests because there are dependencies between tests, that might be essential to understand if you're going to do test automation, because you've got to run this before that and so on, because the data for the second test comes from the first. But then you are, by building in those dependencies, you're also making your tests slightly less maintainable in that respect. So there's a consequence to building in dependencies between tests, but it might be inevitable. You have to think about this before you commit to saying, well, we're going to build 1,000 automated tests. Build in any dependencies you like. that's a recipe for probable disaster, I think. So,
Yep.
but understanding sequencing and how it works is part of the game. It has to be. Okay. Repeat testing. I mean, very straightforwardly, what is our policy for retesting and regression testing? The call on the developers would be, I would expect, that whenever someone logs a bug that they diagnose and then fix, they should certainly retest it to their own satisfaction. And probably, if they have automated tests at the unit level, they should run all their automated unit tests before they commit the code back into the library and ship it to, say, the system tester who found the original bug. With regression testing, there's a whole string of criteria that can be used to identify things to include in regression tests in the first place, but also to include in a test execution of regression tests, because you might not want to run the entirety of all your regression tests. And criteria about, maybe look at the complexity of it, whether it's a critical feature, whether it's an error-prone feature that is always going wrong. These are the kind of criteria you might apply for selecting things to regression test. Over to you, Simon, I think.
I don't have much to add, to be honest. Again, it's a thinking those things through kind of issue. Once you've done the thinking, implementing it is trivial.
Okay, I agree.
Or relatively trivial, obviously, depending on what it is you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, indeed. So moving on, delivery. I mean, it's probably not quite the right sequence. You might want to think about environments before you start doing other things, but all testing takes place in the context of an environment. Now, again, if you've tested for any length of time, you've almost certainly experienced the problem of working in shared environments where other testers are conflicting with your tests, or developers are doing some stuff in your environment and playing around and screwing up your test data, or the system admin is applying new patches which are undermining your the credibility of the test results that you created yesterday, and so on and so forth. So the whole notion of environments is understanding what you need and when, but also how it's delivered, controlled, and managed. And the bigger the project, the more critical it is to understand how environments are put together, because they're immensely complex in some organizations now. So environments, the strategy has to be clear about how environments are defined, delivered, controlled, and managed.
Yep, nothing to add.
Okay. Nothing on what's on the screen there. So you've got a.
Well, so we've got some configurations there. I mean, in TestRail, we've got a test plan set up with some configurations which are running against different environments. But I think you were talking more about provisioning those environments in the first place, and the planning that needs to go into that.
Yep, indeed. Okay, so moving swiftly on. The delivery approach, the information delivery approach, is really how you hand off to your stakeholders. So with a developer, a bug report, which we've all done in the past, is probably the mechanism you're going to use. With senior stakeholders, the way you present information and the reporting in particular is critical. So again, that should be a strategic decision, a choice.
Yep, and reporting. Make sure you're generating good reports from your testing.
Yep. Okay, moving on. Incident management is kind of it's a moot point whether it's a piece of logistics or it's a strategic choice. But incident management it's a mechanism for controlling rework in effect. And the rework is rework of the software, but retesting is kind of rework, and regression testing also is rework of a form. So with the best plan in the world, what tends to happen is when you start finding problems with the software, the plan goes out the window and the project becomes driven by incidents. So certainly if you're creating larger chunks of functionality and delivering larger pieces of functionality into larger environments with whole teams testing them, the plan almost goes out the window and the whole project is driven by incidents. When you're working in an agile team with individual stories might be features might be batted to and fro between testers and developers, but the incident management approach is critical to understanding how you manage the process of delivery of the information. You okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, we had a little bit of discussion around this one, didn't we? In terms of, you know, I think we talked about incidents being bugs, and I must admit, I tend to see incidents from a sort of an incident to me is something like the test environments aren't available for some reason. That I would class as an incident on a test project, because
Yeah, I would too.
it's something that's kind of outside of the control of testing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole notion of unplanned events, like your environment going down because it affects the what the testers can do, but it also, because testing is typically on the critical path. If your environment goes down for a day, your project just slipped by a day. So it's that's why I would do exactly the same. Certainly in practice, acts of God, let's call them, are incidents just the same as bugs.
Yeah.
Okay. End game. I think we're getting there. The end game, I mean, that label is really, you know, when the point comes at the end of testing to hand off to a board of directors or the product owner or whoever's in authority to make the decision to go live or not. How is that handover of information and that process going to be managed? So typically we don't create perfect software, so there may be known bugs which require workarounds, which may require some testing in their own respect, and so on. So how do we manage this end game, this closing chapter of the whole test process as we hand off to our stakeholders? So again, the strategy should define that process in some level of detail, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, with my product manager hat on, I just want to know what testing's been done, where we are, whether there's, you know, critical issues that need my attention, and are we ready to ship yet? And so long as the information you're providing me tells me that, I will probably be pretty happy.
Indeed. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell the critical aspects of strategy covered. So I just want to summarize and just say that the strategy is not a document. You might document it, but that's not the goal. The goal is to go through the thought process, the conversations, the activity of making those decisions, to define your testing mission and how you approach to achieving it. I say again, the questions of test strategy are universal in my opinion, but the answers are different depending on the project and the context you work in, obviously. Ultimately, testing is an information provision service, and one way of looking at it is testers is they're like journalists, investigative journalists. They ask awkward questions, they get answers, and they have to provide some kind of analysis to hand off to stakeholders for them to use that data to make decisions. I think too often testers take it personally when they encounter problems in software. It's not for testers to decide whether the quality of the product is high or low or anything in between. It's for your stakeholders to decide if the news you give them is good or bad. And I think with that, I'm done, Simon. So I think I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I have taken back control.
In the best respect.
Indeed, yeah. Let me just bring up the right window if I can. There we go. All right, so we are pretty much out of time. There were a couple of questions popped up that I'd like to try and get answered if we can. So this one's from Ketki Karichiwala. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. What do you do when you're not provided with any requirements, any sources of information for your testing up front, I guess, and are asked to create a test strategy?
Okay, so I can't understand how. There are always sources of information, let's put it that way. So if you're given some software and to test, and there's absolutely no information coming with it to explain how it should work, all you can do in principle is say, well, this is what this software does, and based on my experience and knowledge and track record of doing this kind of job before, I've encountered some failures, clear and obvious failures, which, you know, I've logged. But I don't think the situation would ever exist that there is no information, no source of information. The developers who wrote the code must have written the code with some notion of a requirement in mind. So the developers themselves must have had conversations with users or whatever. It may be those users are off the project and the developer were left to themselves, and then you're in the team just to help the developers achieve some mission. My suggestion would be to get closer to the developers, shift left if you like, get inside their heads, ask the questions that you would have asked the users, ask the developers those very same questions. And if the developer says, well, I don't know the answer to that, you've then got a bit of a challenge to say, well, hold on, the software you've written, what does it do? You know, what did you intend it to do? And at the very least, you can test it against those intents. But if the developer is saying, look, I'm building software, I don't know its purpose, I don't know what it's for, there's something seriously wrong with your project. I have encountered once a situation where a person in government was given a CD with some software on it and asked to test it, and it was encrypted. So firstly, they couldn't get into it and couldn't access the data at all, and they were asked to test it. And I was asked the same question, you know, how do I test it? I'd say, well, I'm not entirely sure what you can do reliably without being like a safecracker to get into it, you know, like a security hacker to get into it before you even understand what the software product is doing. So that's a very unusual and exceptional circumstance. How can you write software without knowing what it should do? I think it's been done, but I think the tester has a very obvious duty to say, this is brainless.
Yeah. I mean, I think as you said, and as I said during the webinar, it kind of comes down to identifying some oracles that you can refer to that are going to help you carry out the testing that you think you should be doing if you haven't got any documented requirements or whatever to refer to.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing would be just exploration, right? And I mean, I'm thinking of an example where you've got an outsourced penetration test or something along those lines, right? Where those kind of engagements mean that the company is kind of coming in on the basis of them not knowing, them not having privileged information about how your network's configured, where your servers are, what their IP addresses are, and all of those kind of things. And their process necessitates, you know, exploration as being the kind of first step. And they may use some tools and methodologies to help them carry out that exploration. But ultimately, it's going to boil down to, you know, poking the software in a few places and seeing what happens, right? And then you know, forming a hypothesis, and then, you know, seeking to prove or disprove it, and continuing onwards on that basis. And you always have that option with any piece of software or whatever it is that you're testing you pick up. You know, if I drop it, does it crack? If I throw it at a wall, you know, does it bounce off again?
Yeah. So with security, I mean, there's security testers typically are driven by a whole series of known exploits which they're checking against. And so there are databases of all these with tens of thousands of different exploits. So they have these exploits typically are not associated with the functionality, but rather with vulnerabilities of the software product. So in the same way, every tester can test for screen crashes and consistency between screens, and usability almost always starts from I don't have a requirement, but I'm going to use my knowledge, experience, intuition, and just to look at the behavior of software from the perspective of a user and say, well, hold on, it's not well documented, this is tricky, I didn't know where I was, I lost track of where I was in my transaction, and so on and so on and so forth. So of course it's possible to test, but you're testing against a set of an oracle which is not defined by your stakeholders necessarily. So you need to, you know, judge whether that's a valid approach. So if you have a stakeholder at all, the stakeholder should know what the product should do, because you're going to sort of throw a bug at them and say, well, how important is this bug? If they don't know, then you really are in trouble. So I don't accept that you have zero information and zero sources of knowledge. because at some point you're going to ask the question, does this work correctly in your opinion, Mr. Stakeholder? You're the user, you know. Anyway, so to me it's a theoretical question, but certainly what the strategic view would be is you have to identify these sources. If there are no sources, you have difficulty in judging whether the product meets a requirement, because if you don't have a requirement, what are you testing against? You can only test against the tester's knowledge and experience, which is not necessarily a good idea, you know, to tell you whether the product does what it should.
We've waxed long and lyrical on that question.
I think so.
I'm hesitant, but I think we'll try and squeeze in one more quick question. So here's one from Mate Gom. How to manage uncertainty or questions without answers. So is it good to make assumptions in order to create a test strategy in light of, you know, questions without answers and uncertainty is the question.
So question without an answer. So suppose
cue rabbit hole.
So I can imagine, suppose you're in an environment where you've got requirements, but you know the requirements are really high level. They don't give you much detail. They're not much use to the tester, let alone the developer. I think all you can do is to say, well, if you speculate and say, well, if I run a test and I see a behavior and I haven't got a source of information that tells me whether that behavior is correct or not, I kind of need to consult somebody or make an assumption and saying, well, I've not tested it. What I've done is I've explored this functionality, and in these situations, it does this, this, and this. This, Mr. Stakeholder, is what your product does. Now, you're not in a position to log a bug, because if you don't understand what the functionality should be, all you can do is saying, this is what it does. I've done a demonstration of what it actually does and how it actually behaves. So strategically, you could say, well, where the tester doesn't have an oracle to determine expected behavior, they should report the behavior of the system as tested, as explored, maybe, you might say. And you have to leave it at that and say, well, I can't make any judgment on whether this is correct or not, but this is what it does, Mr. Stakeholder. You've got to live with it. I mean, in some ways, that is not such an outrageous situation, because if you're taking a package solution, you don't get a set of requirements for the package. You get kind of a user guide and probably some specifications of how data are processed behind the scenes. But quite often, you get the package as is, and if it exhibits a behavior that you don't understand, well, it's something to take up with the package supplier. That's relatively common. But the package supplier is your oracle, I guess, in that situation.
Yeah, agree. If we weren't able to test without making a few assumptions, then we'd never get any testing done, right?
Well, I would say it's not testing, because if you don't know what the expected behavior is, you can't judge whether the actual behavior is correct or not. Now, the expected behavior might be something in your head and say, well, look, typically, if the system is telling me it's doing an addition, well, I know what addition is, and 2 + 3 make 5, you know. So yeah, I know what my experience is good enough in that respect. But if it's an accounting package and the transaction posts a journal to a ledger, but also under the bonnet it sends a message from the package to another product, is that correct, yes or no? Well, I've no idea. How would you know? You're gonna have to talk to the techies who wrote the software or delivered it and say, well, is this correct behavior? And if they don't know, someone's written some code without knowing what they're doing, and that's not a good place to be. So I always think, when you're testing software, somebody must know what they were trying to do at the time, unless it's a piece of code that's legacy code written 20 years ago and all the team that wrote it are dead and buried and gone home, whatever. You're left with some code that does what it does, and there's an end to it. You can only share what you learn about that software, rather than consider whether you found a bug or anomaly or whatever, because you don't know what it was meant to do in the first place. Interesting question.
It was, yes. and with that, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Gerard. Thank you very much, Paul.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Keep an eye out for Paul over the coming months. We're expecting to be publishing some white papers relating to test management and test strategies. So this would likely be the first in a sequence of webinars with white papers and other bits and pieces of content to follow. While you're waiting for some of those to come out, we have got a new penetration testing ebook in the meantime, so I'll share that link with you at the end. I'm Simon Knight. Paul, you can stay in contact via the links there. Likewise, myself. A big thank you to everybody for joining the webinar. I'm sorry we couldn't get around to answering all of your questions. We'll try to follow up with some of those on the subsequent blog post. And as I mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded. We'll upload it to that blog post as soon as it's been processed, etc. The link for the penetration testing book that I mentioned earlier is here. Watch out for more of Paul's stuff from us in the future. After the webinar, we'll be asking a few quick questions, so please try and answer those if you can. Thanks again to Paul for speaking today, and we'll see you all at the next one. Thank you very much and goodbye.